I'm apologies that I missed the first half. I'm definitely bummed, but I was teaching my in the conflict intervention module this week was on the justification of force to save others. So we were talking about homonationalism and pinkwashing and things that I think there's a good chance we'll be talking about in part here as well. But I did want to spend, I will speak about my article and the book that's related to it, but I also wanted to talk about a bit about how I got to where I am in terms of doing the research I'm doing, and some of the challenges, opportunities of navigating between different communities with academia and policy work as well. I really want to hear from other folks that I know are also navigating this space. But so prior to my academic work, I was working with civil society. So I worked with Peace Women and the Global Network of Women Peace Builders. And these are organizations based in New York City. And so I really got to know women, peace, and security as a frame from the side of civil society. That said, it was civil society based in New York City. So I do want to contextualize that. But I learned about women, peace, and security while I was very much engaged in feminist and queer organizing spaces in New York City. And so I was having this kind of, okay, I want to do work in women's rights. I want to do something related to international human rights work. And so I was excited to learn about women, peace, and security, but I was really frustrated at the way gender was being talked about. That didn't seem to reflect the spaces that I was engaged with in feminist and queer activism. And So from noticing this gap in terms of, and not really being sure if this is like a gap that, seeing lesbians literally not being talked about in several 100-page documents about women, and finding that very strange, motivated me to ask more questions of women, peace, and security practitioners. And so this is, when I pursued the PhD. I also want to mention that Heike Schoten was on my committee. So it was really fantastic to hear about her in your book, Saeed. So that was like really very cool. It is a small world, I will also say, in a beautiful and challenging way. Challenging, I'll say more so in terms of it's really hard to be doing this scholarship without some of the mentorship that one might hope. I think a lot of us end up I'm just really grateful when people reach out to me and I'm able to have those calls, because I know that for some people that's really, really hard. So that's another reason why spaces like this are really important. But on the good side, it's a small world. That means that in a space like this, we have crossover, as I've talked about. But so I really wanted to sort of bridge some of the communities in terms of what I saw as activism work and even policy-focused work from feminist and queer organizing that was just not seemingly in conversation with gender, peace, and security work. So I do, when I'm doing, a lot of times my work is geared more towards like the women, peace, and security space, right? So I'm bringing over insights from sexuality studies, from queer activism into spaces that are still really quite heteronormative, right? And so it's still like most of the time when I'm brought into like a panel on women, peace, and security, or like I'm speaking to people that are doing this foreign policy work, I'm saying, sexual orientation and gender identity is a dimension of talking about gender, right? Like that sort of thing. And so my research is really motivated by knowing that there's this long history of anti-war activism and coalitional organizing with queer activists and anti-war activists, but sort of seeing this dissipate into, when we talk about women, peace, and security, WPS, it often, by the point it's been institutionalized, it's nowhere to be found in this work. So I was curious if this was intentional, and I continue to be curious if this is intentional, or through the interviews I did when I initially started doing this work with practitioners, a lot of times folks were telling me, oh yeah, I guess I'd never really thought about that. I'd never really thought about sexuality as being a dimension of this, which in a way is better than being told we don't want to talk about queers, but it does suggest how well, I think that certainly foreshadows the challenge of how it relies, you know, the small or queer and trans organizations that are unfunded and already on the, you know, marginalized, are then kind of left with doing the advocacy work for, you know, queer experience and queer inclusion, and, you know, to say nothing of actually leading in terms of what peace building might look like from the perspective of queer communities. So, you know, I argue that it's really the responsibility of all feminist organizing and all gender, peace, and security work to be foregrounding LGBTQ experiences, and that we're really missing out on a lot by not doing that. And as a lesbian doing this research, it's something that I'm really motivated to, you know, help make some of these connections. But I did want to say, you know, reflect a bit about, so the article came out in 2016. I would say there's been a really remarkable shift towards actually wanting to take up some of the calls I make in that article, right? So Outright Action International is now a part of the NGO working group. And there's also, right now I'm working with Outright Action International as a consultant on a project where we're reaching out to LGBTQ organizations to ask them, you know, okay, if Outright starts doing more queer peace and security work, where should we go? What would be helpful? What work are you already doing? Which is to say, they're interested in funding this and doing this work, and also to say that that doesn't exist, right? But we're at a moment where they're seeing an opening to start doing this work. So it is really remarkable to write scholarship that then within a couple of years, it's taken up in this way. And to be, you know, invited in as sort of like the academic, but also be, you know, essentially just quoting directly from what folks at Columbia Diversa are saying needs to happen, right? Just kind of being the link to say, here's the organizations in Columbia that have been doing this for a decade. They have 10 reports in Spanish if you're interested. And, you know, here's how we can start like taking this up more seriously. So I will say, like, as a scholar, it's exciting to be in those spaces, but it's also, I'm the person that UNDP called to talk about LGBTQ people and development. And like, okay, but I think I look forward to when there's more support and collaboration across communities, and it's not, you know, a scholar who is white. And I mean, I guess technically I am living in post-conflict because I'm in Belfast, but I do think there's an important moment where there is more investment in having the people who can really speak to what actions UNDP should be taking will be on the roster of folks who are contacted, because still organizations tell me, including LGBTQ organizations, will tell me, like, I don't know where the queer women are to talk to. And I think we could talk about that more in our conversation in terms of what we think about that or what next steps might be for that. But I do think that I love your book ending on the queer utopia. And I think also so much of my work is really motivated on finding the ordinary spaces of queer resistance, right? And also queer refusal. And I think as an academic, I've had to find that. I mean, I don't think it's possible to survive in the institution without finding those spaces of queer refusal. And I think, that's something that I'm still navigating the boundaries of in terms of what that means. I mean, we're about to go on 10 days of strikes. So, and that's like my third time being on strike since coming here, I think. But also I think finding refusal in terms of when we say no, in terms of maybe being the person who's like part of collaborating to do certain work, or when we say no in terms of something I've been thinking about more is like what field work to say no to. And I really challenge students to think about that, because I think there's a lot of interest and there is a lack of research and or at least like research out of, let's say, global North institutions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's appropriate for certain topics to be research topics for PhD students, I would argue. But I think that type of refusal is something that that I haven't seen taken up as much. And I will, just to get back to, you know, the article and where the book is and all of that, like I did make these key recommendations, which are really what I'm still sitting with. And I think there's queering in the sense of thinking about peace building differently with queer leadership and LGBTQ organizations. But then there's also, I still insist that bringing, queering women, peace, and security is in part about including LGBTQ people and being intentional, and just not just because you're not sure who to talk to, that's not enough. Like, there needs to be more investment from these organizations that are doing peace building work to take that up. And also, as I was saying earlier, it's also about not defaulting to maybe the gay men that are able to be more visible. And I think there's something that also came up in your book about this question about how people who are maybe in a position of being expats might be, or people who aren't necessarily located in the conflict but are part of the community, might be voices that could be really helpful for these addressing this very real challenge. Like, I'm not saying it's not hard to access and connect with queer women in some of these conflict spaces. I'm just saying, like, I think, okay, so we need to think creatively, we need to think queerly about what this means in terms of which women are invited and how we can change that. And, thinking about sexual orientation and gender identity as a part of indicators of whether or not you've thought about gender in a meaningful way or done included a gender perspective in peace building work. I continue to emphasize defining women and gender separately, distinctly. And certainly I think there's more of a push now to collect data about LGBTQ individuals, but recognizing LGBTQ as a lump only gets you so far. And so how do we disaggregate this? And I think, again, engaging with a UN independent expert is a really, I think, potentially powerful way to challenge and push what peace building looks like. And actually, the independent expert just put out a call for input. I don't know how many folks have seen this, but they put out a call for input on peace and security. So it's like the first time there's really going to be a report by the UN, certainly by the independent expert, that's looking at SOGI, peace and conflict. And so I'll be really interested to see the previous report, they just did one, I think less than a year ago, on gender theory. Those reports are really fascinating to watch in terms of who's interested in speaking to definitions of gender and human rights and SOGI. So I think I also would just say that in order to actually address the anti-gender backlash that so many women's human rights defenders are facing, it's really critical to see the backlash that the queerphobia and transphobia is directly related to this backlash. And so I see that, certainly in scholarship, I see this as an opportunity to help make those connections for folks. But I also think that just means thinking differently about what peace and conflict looks like. That certainly certain ideas about what security looks like, they're not neutral, and they're not going to be experienced the same way by queer and trans communities, which is why it matters to have them in the room, but not only have them in the room, but actually help prioritize for I think more complex ideas about what peace and security looks like. And I think I'll leave it at that because I'm looking forward to the conversation. And thanks.